The shattered glass crunched beneath Detective Maria Santos's boots as she stepped through what had once been the grand entrance of City Hall. Emergency lights cast eerie red shadows across the marble floors, now littered with torn documents, overturned furniture, and the remnants of what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated ransacking. Behind her, the wail of sirens continued to pierce the pre-dawn darkness, while news vans already lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray sky like mechanical prayers. "Christ Almighty," Santos muttered, surveying the devastation. File cabinets hung open like broken jaws, their contents scattered across the floor in a chaotic paper snowstorm. The mayor's office door stood ajar, revealing an interior that looked as though a tornado had torn through it. But something felt wrong about this scene. Something too deliberate in the destruction, too precise in its chaos. Her radio crackled to life. "Santos, we need you out front. They're bringing him in now." She made her way back through the debris, past the crime scene photographers capturing every shattered window and overturned desk. Outside, a crowd had gathered despite the early hour, their faces illuminated by the strobing lights of police cruisers and ambulances. The air buzzed with tension, thick with the electricity that precedes a storm. Then she saw him, Mayor James Washington, the city's first black mayor, emerged from the back of a patrol car with his hands cuffed behind his back. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his dignified bearing somehow maintained even in this moment of public humiliation. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks as reporters surged forward, shouting questions that cut through the morning air like knives. "Mayor Washington, did you orchestrate this break-in? Is it true you stole the pension funds? How do you respond to allegations of corruption?" Washington's wife, Diane, pushed through the crowd, her face streaked with tears. "This is a lie!" she screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. "My husband is innocent. He's been working all night on the equity program presentation. He wasn't even here." Santos watched the scene unfold with growing unease. In her 15 years on the force, she'd learned to trust her instincts, and right now, every instinct was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. The timing was too convenient, the evidence too neat, the destruction too theatrical. 3 weeks earlier, the atmosphere in City Hall had been entirely different. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the conference room, where Mayor Washington stood before a presentation screen, his sleeves rolled up, tie loosened from hours of preparation. Charts and graphs displayed demographic data, budget allocations, and timeline projections for the most ambitious social reform program the city had ever attempted. The Equity Initiative will address decades of systemic inequality, Washington explained to his senior staff, his voice carrying the passion that had gotten him elected. Housing assistance, job training programs, educational grants, healthcare access. We're talking about fundamentally changing how this city serves its most vulnerable residents. Deputy Mayor Rachel Chen nodded as she reviewed the documents. The numbers look solid. James, federal matching funds, state grants, private foundation commitments. We're looking at $47 million in the first year alone. The community response has been overwhelmingly positive, added Community Liaison Director Michael Torres. We've had over 300 people sign up for the information sessions. The churches, the community centers, the neighborhood associations. They're all on board. Washington smiled, the kind of genuine expression that had made him beloved in the neighborhoods where he'd grown up. This is what we came here to do. People. This is why we ran for office. Not to maintain the status quo, but to create real change. But across town, in the pristine kitchen of her sprawling suburban home, Karen Whitmore was having a very different conversation. She held her phone pressed against her ear with a manicured hand, while pacing across Italian marble tiles, her voice sharp with indignation. "No, you don't understand. Patricia." She snapped at her friend on the other end of the line. "This isn't just about money. This is about them taking over everything we've worked for. Our neighborhoods, our schools, our way of life." Karen was 43 years old, blonde, and possessed of the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. Her husband owned 3 car dealerships. Her children attended private schools, and she sat on the boards of several charitable organizations where she was known for her strong opinions and stronger voice. "Have you seen the property values in Riverside since they started that low-income housing project?" She continued, her voice rising. "Down 18% in 6 months. And now they want to expand it citywide with our tax dollars." She paused at her kitchen window, looking out at her perfectly manicured lawn, her expression hardening. "Well, I'm not going to sit here and let them destroy everything our families have built. There has to be a way to stop this madness." That evening, Karen attended what was officially listed as a book club meeting at the community center. But the dozen women gathered in the circle of folding chairs weren't discussing literature. They were discussing strategy. "The announcement is scheduled for Friday," said Beverly Hartwell, a real estate agent who'd seen her listing stagnate as demographics shifted. "Once they make it official, once the federal money starts flowing, it'll be too late to stop." "We need to think bigger," Karen said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Peaceful protests, petitions, city council meetings. None of that is working. They're not listening to us. Maybe it's time they understood there are consequences to ignoring the taxpayers who actually fund this city." The women exchanged glances, some uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was heading, others nodding in agreement. Karen had always been the most vocal, the most willing to push boundaries. But tonight, there was something different in her tone, something that made the air in the room feel charged with possibility and danger. "What exactly are you suggesting?" asked Margaret Kellner, whose husband owned a construction company that had been passed over for several recent city contracts. Karen leaned forward, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I'm suggesting that sometimes, when the system fails, you have to work outside the system. I'm suggesting that maybe it's time Washington and his friends learned what happens when they bite the hand that feeds them." 2 days later, Karen made a phone call that would change everything. She sat in her BMW in the parking lot of a shopping mall, the engine running, her hands trembling slightly as she dialed a number she'd obtained through connections she'd rather not name. "Is this Marcus?" she asked when a deep voice answered. "Depends who's asking. I'm someone who might have a business proposition for you. Someone told me you and your associates are skilled at problem solving." There was a long pause. "What kind of problems?" "The kind that require creative solutions. The kind that pay very well for the right people with the right skills and the right discretion." Marcus Rodriguez was 28 years old, covered in tattoos, and possessed of a criminal record that included burglary, assault, and drug distribution. He ran with a crew of 6 men who specialized in jobs that fell into the gray areas between petty crime and organized criminal enterprise. They weren't ideological. They weren't political. They were simply mercenary. "Lady, I don't know who gave you my number, but I don't talk business over the phone," Marcus said. "Then let's meet. Tonight. I'll make it worth your time." They met at a diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the coffee was weak and the lighting was dim, and no one asked questions about unusual conversations. Karen arrived first, choosing a booth in the back corner. her designer purse clutched tightly against her side. When Marcus walked in, she almost lost her nerve. He was larger than she'd expected, more intimidating, his presence filling the space around him like a dark cloud. "You the lady who called?" he asked, sliding into the booth across from her. "Karen," she said, extending a hand that he didn't take. "So what's this about?" Karen glanced around the nearly empty diner, then leaned across the table. "I need something that looks like a robbery, but isn't a robbery. I need something that creates chaos, but serves a purpose. And I need someone who's smart enough to understand the difference between those two things." Marcus studied her face, taking in the expensive clothes, the nervous energy, the desperate hunger in her eyes. "You want to frame someone?" "I want to save my city from people who are destroying it," Karen replied. "There's going to be an announcement on Friday, a program that will fundamentally change the character of our community. I need that announcement to be delayed, indefinitely." "And how exactly does that work for me?" Karen reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope thick with cash. 5,000 now, 15 more when the job is done. All you have to do is make City Hall unusable for official business and make sure the right people get blamed for it. Marcus counted the bills, his expression unreadable. 20,000 to trash a government building and set up some politicians. Lady, that's either the easiest money I've ever made or the most dangerous. Which is it? "It's the most important," Karen said. "And if you do this right, if you follow my instructions exactly, it's also the safest. The people I'm targeting, they have enemies in high places. When this goes down, those enemies will be very motivated to make sure the investigation goes in the right direction." They spent the next hour planning. Karen had done her homework, studying City Hall's security systems, the staff schedules, the building layout. She knew which offices contained the most sensitive documents, which rooms would create the most dramatic visual impact, which evidence would be most damaging to the mayor and his allies. "You need to make it look personal," she insisted. "Not random vandalism, not professional burglary. It needs to look like someone with inside knowledge, someone with access, someone with a grudge against specific people. And you want it to happen when?" "Thursday night, late, after the cleaning crew leaves but before the morning security sweep. That gives us Friday for the story to develop, weekend for the investigation to stall, and by Monday, the whole narrative will be set in stone." Marcus pocketed the cash and stood up. "Lady, I hope you know what you're doing, because once this starts, there's no taking it back." Karen watched him leave, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She'd crossed a line tonight, stepped into territory she'd never imagined exploring. But as she thought about the equity initiative, about the changes coming to her city, about the future she was fighting to preserve, she convinced herself that desperate times called for desperate measures. The next morning, she made another phone call, this one to Detective Lieutenant Robert Shaw, a man she'd known since high school, a man whose political views aligned closely with her own, a man who owed his current position to connections that included Karen's husband's business associates. "Bobby, it's Karen Whitmore. I need to talk to you about something important." "Karen, hey, what's going on?" "Not over the phone. Can you meet me for lunch? Something's come to my attention that I think you need to know about. Something involving City Hall and some very questionable financial arrangements." They met at the country club, in the dining room overlooking the golf course, where the city's power brokers conducted their real business away from public scrutiny. Shaw was a 20-year veteran of the police force, a man whose career had stagnated under previous administrations, but who harbored ambitions of higher rank and political influence. Bobby, I'm going to share something with you that you cannot share with anyone else. At least not yet. Karen began, her voice low and urgent. I have reason to believe that Mayor Washington and his inner circle are involved in some very serious financial improprieties. Shaw leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of improprieties? Kickbacks, embezzlement, possibly even ties to organized crime. I can't reveal my sources yet, but I have information that suggests they're using this equity initiative as a front to funnel money to their associates and campaign contributors. It was a lie, but it was a lie wrapped in enough truth to be believable. Shaw had always resented Washington's reform agenda, had always suspected that the new administration looked down on cops like him, cops who'd learned policing in a different era, under different rules. That's a serious accusation, Karen. I know it is, and I'm going to get you proof. But when I do, when this all comes out, I need to know that the investigation will be handled by someone I trust, someone who won't let politics interfere with justice. Shaw nodded slowly. If what you're saying is true, if you can provide evidence, I guarantee you it will be investigated thoroughly and objectively. Karen smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. I knew I could count on you. Bobby, I've always known you were one of the good ones. Thursday night arrived with a storm that seemed almost too perfect for the occasion. Rain hammered against the windows of City Hall as the cleaning crew finished their work and headed home, their footsteps echoing through empty corridors. The security guard made his rounds at 11 o'clock, checking doors and windows before settling into his booth with a crossword puzzle and a thermos of coffee. At 2:17 a.m., Marcus and his crew approached the building through the service alley, their faces covered, their movements practiced and efficient. They'd disabled the alarm system using codes that Karen had somehow obtained through her network of connections and favors. The back door opened silently, and they slipped inside like shadows given form. What followed was destruction with purpose, chaos with design. They ransacked offices systematically, targeting specific files and documents that Karen had identified. Financial records disappeared into duffel bags, while less important papers were scattered across floors. Computer hard drives were removed with surgical precision, while keyboards and monitors were smashed with theatrical violence. In Mayor Washington's office, they overturned furniture and spray-painted gang tags on the walls. But they also planted evidence bank statements showing deposits that didn't exist, phone records connecting Washington to known criminals, photographs that had been digitally manipulated to show meetings that had never occurred. The crown jewel of their operation was the mayor's personal safe, which they cracked open to reveal documents that Karen had planted there weeks earlier during a public reception, using her access as a board member of the Children's Hospital Foundation to slip away from the crowd and into restricted areas. By 4:30 a.m., they were gone, leaving behind a scene that would dominate news cycles for weeks to come. Marcus drove to the predetermined meeting point, a parking garage downtown, where Karen waited in her BMW with the remainder of his payment. It's done, he said, sliding into the passenger seat. Any problems? Clean as a whistle. Your boy's going to have some explaining to do. Karen handed him the envelope of cash, her hands steady now, her voice calm. Remember, you were never here. We never met. If anyone asks, you and your crew were in Atlantic City last night, gambling and drinking and establishing alibis. Lady, for 20 grand. I was wherever you want me to have been. As Marcus disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, Karen sat alone in her car, staring at the city skyline. In a few hours, her plan would be set in motion. The discovery, the investigation, the arrests. Washington would be destroyed. His administration would collapse, and the equity initiative would die with them. She picked up her phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? Karen took a deep breath, then let tears creep into her voice. I want to report a break-in at City Hall. I was driving by and saw people inside with flashlights. I think they're still in there. By dawn, the machinery of scandal was in full motion. Detective Shaw arrived on scene and immediately took charge of the investigation, his first act being to call for a warrant to search Mayor Washington's home. The evidence they found there, evidence that Marcus had planted during a separate break-in the night before, was damning cash hidden in the bedroom safe, encrypted hard drives hidden in the basement, communications with known criminals hidden in a secret email account. The arrest was made with maximum publicity, timed to coincide with the morning news broadcasts. Washington was led away in handcuffs, while reporters shouted questions and cameras captured every moment of his humiliation. His wife collapsed on the front lawn of their home, held up by their teenage daughter, whose tears streamed down her face as she watched her father's reputation destroyed in real time. But the plan was even more diabolical than simple frame-up. Karen had anticipated that Washington's supporters would react with anger, that the black community would see the arrest as part of a larger pattern of persecution. She'd counted on that anger, planned for it, weaponized it. By noon, crowds had gathered outside City Hall, demanding Washington's release. By evening, those crowds had grown larger and more vocal. By midnight, when news broke that similar evidence had been found in the homes of Deputy Mayor Chen and Community Liaison Director Torres, the protests had turned violent. Karen watched the coverage from her living room, a glass of wine in her hand, her husband beside her on the couch. "It's terrible what's happening," she said to the news cameras, speaking as a concerned citizen outside City Hall the next morning. "But when our leaders betray our trust, when they steal from the taxpayers and consort with criminals, people have a right to be angry." The riots spread through the downtown area over the weekend, fueled by a complex mixture of legitimate anger at injustice and manufactured outrage at crimes that had never been committed. Store windows were smashed, police cars were overturned, and the National Guard was called in to restore order. Through it all, Karen played her role perfectly, the concerned citizen, the voice of reason, the bridge between law enforcement and the community. She appeared on local news programs calling for calm, while simultaneously suggesting that Washington supporters were proving their own violent nature through their response to his arrest. "I understand their pain," she said during one interview, her expression carefully composed to suggest both sympathy and resolve. "But destroying our city won't bring back the money their leader stole. It won't undo the betrayal of trust. At some point, we have to move forward and start rebuilding both our buildings and our faith in democratic institutions." What Karen didn't know was that Detective Maria Santos had never stopped feeling uneasy about the case. While her colleagues focused on processing the mountain of evidence against Washington and his associates, Santos kept returning to the crime scene, studying the patterns of destruction, analyzing the methodology of the break-in. Something about the ransacking bothered her. It was too thorough in some areas, too random in others. Professional burglars didn't usually bother with theatrical touches, like spray-painted gang tags, and gang members didn't usually have the technical expertise to crack high-end safes or remove computer hard drives without damaging other components. She began her own investigation, working quietly and methodically, following leads that her superiors had dismissed as irrelevant. She interviewed the cleaning crew, studied the security footage from surrounding buildings, analyzed the financial records that had supposedly incriminated Washington. The breakthrough came when she discovered that one of the encrypted hard drives found in Washington's basement contained files with metadata, showing they had been created weeks after Washington's computer had been confiscated. Someone had planted evidence that couldn't possibly have been created by the person it was supposed to incriminate. Santos took this information to FBI Special Agent David Park, a federal investigator who specialized in public corruption cases. Park had been monitoring the situation in the city with growing skepticism, noting that the evidence against Washington seemed almost too perfect, too comprehensive, too neatly packaged. Detective Santos, what you're suggesting is that someone orchestrated this entire scenario to frame the mayor and his administration, Park said as they sat in his office reviewing the files. That's exactly what I'm suggesting, and I think I know how to prove it. Park authorized a broader investigation, one that included surveillance of the key players in the case. They began monitoring phone calls, tracking financial transactions, following the money trail that connected the various pieces of planted evidence. The surveillance of Marcus Rodriguez proved particularly fruitful. Despite his attempts to maintain a low profile, Marcus couldn't resist spending his newfound wealth, and his sudden affluence after a lifetime of petty crime drew the attention of federal investigators who specialized in following money laundering operations. When confronted with evidence of his recent windfall and offered immunity in exchange for cooperation, Marcus broke quickly. He'd been in the criminal justice system long enough to recognize when he was facing serious federal charges, and he'd worked with enough partners to understand the value of being the first to cooperate with authorities. "Look, I didn't know all the details," he told Agent Park during his debriefing. "This lady, she approached me with a job, said she needed City Hall trashed and some politicians framed, paid me 20 grand to make it happen." "What lady?" "Called herself Karen. White lady, blonde, rich, drove a BMW, wore expensive clothes, met me at that diner on Route 9. Park and Santos exchanged glances. They'd been building a profile of the potential conspiracy, but they hadn't expected the mastermind to be someone so visible, so embedded in the community's power structure. "Did she give you specific instructions about what to steal? What evidence to plant?" "Everything was planned out in advance. She had building plans, security codes, knew exactly which offices to hit and which documents to take. She even provided some of the evidence we planted. Said she'd been collecting it for weeks." The investigation accelerated rapidly after Marcus's confession. Federal agents obtained warrants to search Karen's home, her computer, her financial records. They discovered a trove of evidence surveillance photos of City Hall, copies of building security protocols, drafts of false financial documents, and communications with Detective Shaw that revealed the extent of their collaboration. But Karen wasn't finished. When she realized that the investigation was closing in on her, when she understood that Marcus had likely been compromised and that her carefully constructed narrative was beginning to unravel, she made one final, desperate gambit. She called a press conference for Tuesday morning, positioning herself as a whistleblower who had uncovered evidence of Washington's corruption through her own investigation. Standing before a podium at the community center, surrounded by supporters and reporters, she presented herself as a hero who had risked everything to expose the truth. "I want to be clear about something," she said, her voice strong and confident despite the investigation closing in around her. "I've been accused of orchestrating the events at City Hall, of somehow manufacturing evidence against Mayor Washington. These accusations are not only false, they're insulting to every citizen who has been victimized by his administration's corruption. The crowd murmured approval. Karen had spent weeks building her narrative, positioning herself as the voice of legitimate concerns about Washington's policies. Many in the audience genuinely believed that she was being persecuted for speaking truth to power. The FBI wants to silence me because I've exposed their precious mayor as a criminal, she continued. They want to shoot the messenger rather than deal with the message. But I won't be intimidated, and I won't stop fighting for justice. What Karen didn't know was that Agent Park and Detective Santos were watching from the back of the room, and that federal agents were at that moment executing search warrants at her home, her husband's business, and Detective Shaw's residence. The evidence they discovered was overwhelming. Financial records showing Karen's payments to Marcus and his crew. Digital forensics revealing her role in creating the false documents found in Washington's home. Phone records documenting her coordination with Shaw to ensure the investigation would target Washington and his allies. But the most damning evidence was something Karen had never anticipated: security footage from a camera she hadn't known existed. Agent Park interrupted Karen's press conference with a federal arrest warrant and a team of agents. As the cameras rolled and the crowd gasped in shock, Karen was led away in handcuffs, her carefully constructed image crumbling in real time. Karen Whitmore, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under color of law. Park announced loud enough for the microphones to pick up his words. The security footage that proved Karen's guilt had come from an unexpected source, a traffic camera positioned across the street from the diner where she'd met with Marcus. The camera had captured both their faces clearly as they entered and left the restaurant, providing ironclad proof of their connection. But more importantly, additional footage from City Hall's own security system, footage that had been thought lost in the break-in, was recovered from off-site backup servers. This footage showed Karen herself entering the building 2 weeks before the staged break-in, using her access as a Foundation board member to plant evidence in Washington's office safe. The revelation sent shockwaves through the city and beyond. National news networks picked up the story, turning it into a symbol of the lengths to which some people would go to maintain power and resist change. Legal experts called it one of the most elaborate and malicious political frame jobs in recent history. Mayor Washington was released from jail to a crowd of supporters who had never stopped believing in his innocence. His first statement as a free man was characteristically dignified, focusing not on revenge, but on healing. Today, justice has been served, but justice delayed is justice denied, he said, standing on the steps of City Hall with his wife and children beside him. The real tragedy here isn't what happened to me and my colleagues. The real tragedy is what this conspiracy did to our community. How it was designed to turn neighbor against neighbor, to exploit our deepest fears and divisions for political gain. The federal investigation expanded to include everyone who had aided Karen's conspiracy, either knowingly or unknowingly. Detective Shaw was arrested and charged with abuse of power and civil rights violations. Several other city officials who had participated in the rush to judgment against Washington faced administrative sanctions and criminal referrals. Karen's trial became a media spectacle, a daily drama that exposed the intricate details of her conspiracy and the motivations behind it. Prosecutor Sarah Mitchell painted a picture of a woman consumed by racial resentment and class privilege, who had convinced herself that illegal means were justified by righteous ends. The defendant didn't just commit fraud, Mitchell told the jury during closing arguments. She weaponized the criminal justice system itself, turning it into a tool of personal vendetta. She exploited racial tensions, manufactured evidence, and corrupted public officials, all to stop a program that would have helped the city's most vulnerable residents. Karen's defense attorney argued that his client had been genuinely concerned about corruption and had simply been overzealous in her investigation methods. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the conspiracy too elaborate, the damage too extensive for such explanations to carry weight. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Karen was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Her assets were seized to pay restitution to the city and the wrongly accused officials. And her name became synonymous with the dangers of prejudice, unchecked by conscience. Detective Shaw received 8 years for his role in the conspiracy, his career and reputation destroyed by his willingness to let personal bias override professional duty. Marcus Rodriguez, who had cooperated fully with the investigation, received 3 years and provided ongoing assistance to federal investigators pursuing similar cases in other jurisdictions. The Equity Initiative was finally implemented 6 months later, after extensive community input and transparency measures designed to restore public trust. The program exceeded its initial goals, creating thousands of jobs, improving educational outcomes, and reducing crime rates in the neighborhoods that had been most affected by the riots following Washington's arrest. Mayor Washington was re-elected by the largest margin in the city's history, running on a platform of unity and reconciliation. In his victory speech, he spoke about the lessons learned from the crisis and the importance of building systems that could withstand attacks from those who would exploit fear and division. "Democracy is fragile," he said to the crowd gathered in the same square where riots had raged months earlier. "It requires constant vigilance, not just against external threats, but against the internal demons of prejudice and hatred that can corrupt even our most sacred institutions. We've learned that lesson the hard way, but we've learned it together, and we've emerged stronger because of it." Detective Maria Santos was promoted to lieutenant and put in charge of a new federal task force investigating political corruption. Her methodical investigation had not only exposed Karen's conspiracy, but had also revealed vulnerabilities in local and state systems that made such conspiracies possible. The scary thing about this case, Santos reflected years later, wasn't just that someone was willing to go to such lengths to frame innocent people. It was how easy it was. How many people were willing to believe the worst about their elected officials without asking hard questions about the evidence. Karen's conspiracy succeeded, as long as it did, because it told people what they wanted to hear about people they were already predisposed to distrust. The case became the subject of books, documentaries, and academic studies, examining the intersection of race, politics, and criminal justice in America. Karen's conspiracy was dissected in law schools as an example of how personal prejudice could corrupt institutional processes, and in sociology departments as a case study in the manipulation of social tensions for political purposes. But for the people who lived through the crisis, who watched their city burn based on manufactured outrage, who saw their friends and neighbors turn against each other over lies, the lessons were more personal and more painful. The community center where Karen had held her secret meetings was converted into a reconciliation and dialogue center, where people of different backgrounds came together to discuss difficult issues and build understanding across racial and economic lines. The diner where she had met with Marcus was torn down and replaced with a community garden tended by volunteers from across the city. Years later, when the immediate wounds had healed and the city had moved forward, people would still speak about the Karen Whitmore case as a watershed moment, a time when their community was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself and make conscious choices about what kind of place it wanted to be. The children who had watched their mayor led away in handcuffs, who had seen their city burning on television, who had grown up during the trials and investigations, came of age with a different understanding of justice and democracy than previous generations. They were more skeptical of easy answers, more demanding of evidence, more committed to the hard work of building inclusive communities. Mayor Washington served 2 more terms before retiring to teach public policy at the state university. The equity initiative he had fought to implement became a model for other cities, demonstrating that comprehensive approaches to social problems could work when supported by genuine community engagement and transparent governance. Karen Whitmore served her full sentence, declining interviews and maintaining her silence about her motivations and methods. Upon her release, she moved to another state, where she lived quietly under an assumed name. Her previous life and its consequences following her like shadows that could never be fully escaped. The conspiracy she had orchestrated became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly trust could be destroyed and institutions corrupted when people allowed fear and prejudice to override reason and justice. But it also became a story of resilience, of communities' ability to heal and grow stronger when they chose truth over comfortable lies, when they chose unity over division, when they chose hope over hatred. In the end, Karen's attempt to stop progress through deception and manipulation had the opposite effect of what she intended. The equity initiative succeeded beyond anyone's initial expectations. The city became more united and more committed to justice, and the people learned valuable lessons about vigilance and democracy that would serve them for generations to come. The empty lot where City Hall had been temporarily relocated during repairs was eventually turned into a public plaza, with a memorial acknowledging both the damage done by the conspiracy and the healing that had followed. Engraved in stone were the words Mayor Washington had spoken on the day of his release: "Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice ultimately served is hope renewed." And on quiet evenings, when the plaza filled with families and children playing, when people of all backgrounds came together to enjoy the community they had rebuilt together, it was hard to imagine that this peaceful scene had once been the center of a conspiracy designed to tear them apart. The community had not just survived Karen Whitmore's attempt to destroy it. They had transformed that attempt into something stronger, something better, something worthy of the dreams they shared and the future they were building together.